The early morning sun peeked through the windows of Joe's diner, casting long shadows across the worn leather seats. Frank Thompson, a 93-year-old man with silver hair and bright blue eyes, walked slowly through the door at exactly 7:30 a.m. His steps were careful but steady, supported by a wooden cane that had been his companion for the past 5 years. The bell above the door made its usual cheerful sound as Frank entered. Sarah, the young waitress with red hair and a kind smile, looked up from behind the counter. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she called out, already reaching for the coffee pot. Frank gave her a gentle nod and a small wave of his hand. Every morning was the same for Frank. He would walk 6 blocks from his small apartment to the diner, no matter the weather. Sometimes his joints hurt from the old war injuries, but he never missed a day. The routine kept him going, gave him purpose, just like his morning duties in the Navy so many years ago. The corner booth was Frank's special place. Everyone in the diner knew it. The leather seat was a bit more worn on the left side where he always sat, and the table had small scratches from his wedding ring, marks made over 10 years of daily visits. He liked this spot because he could see the whole diner and the street outside, a habit he kept from his military days. Sarah brought over his usual order without him having to ask. 1 cup of black coffee, 2 slices of wheat toast with butter on the side, and a small glass of orange juice. "Here you go, Mr. Thompson. Fresh coffee, just how you like it," she said, placing everything carefully on the table. Frank smiled at her and said his usual "thank you, dear," in his soft, aged voice. From his jacket pocket, Frank pulled out his reading glasses and today's newspaper. He had a special way of reading, starting with the local news, then moving to national stories, and finally ending with the comics. He said the comics were his dessert, something sweet to finish with. His large, weathered hands carefully unfolded the paper, trying not to tear the thin pages. The morning crowd started coming in, the usual faces Frank had grown to know over the years. There was Bob, the mailman, who always grabbed a quick breakfast before starting his route. Jenny, the school teacher, would rush in for her coffee and bagel. They all knew Frank, and they all gave him a respectful nod or a quiet good morning as they passed his booth. As Frank read his paper, he sometimes looked at the old photos he kept in his wallet. Pictures of his time in World War II, serving in the Pacific, his ship, his crew members. Most of them now gone. He couldn't show these photos to many people, but they were always with him, like old friends keeping him company during his morning ritual. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air as the kitchen got busier. Frank liked these morning sounds, the sizzle of the grill, the clinking of coffee cups, the quiet conversations of other customers. It reminded him of the mess hall on his old ship. Though the food here was much better, he would often joke. Sometimes, Frank would write in his small notebook between sips of coffee. He was working on his memories, writing down stories for his grandchildren. He wanted them to know about his life, about the war, about their grandmother Mary who had passed away 5 years ago. His handwriting wasn't as neat as it used to be, but he kept at it, 1 page at a time. The morning light grew stronger as time passed, and Frank watched the town wake up through the diner's large windows. Cars began filling the street, and more people walked past on their way to work. He knew most of their faces, even if he didn't know their names. That's how it was in small towns like this. Frank took his time with breakfast, making his coffee and toast last until about 9:30 a.m. He never rushed. Rushing was for young people, he would say. This morning routine was his way of starting each day right, surrounded by familiar faces and comfortable sounds. It had been this way for years, and Frank hoped it would stay this way for many more mornings to come. Little did Frank know that this peaceful morning routine was about to face an unexpected challenge that would change everything. It started as a normal Tuesday morning at Joe's diner until the ground began to shake with the rumble of motorcycle engines. The peaceful morning quiet that Frank Thompson had grown used to was suddenly broken by the loud roar of 5 heavy bikes pulling into the parking lot. The windows of the diner vibrated as the bikers revved their engines before turning them off. Sarah, the waitress, looked worried as she watched the group of men getting off their motorcycles. They were all wearing black leather jackets with patches, showing they belonged to a local motorcycle club called Road Warriors. The youngest looked about 30, while their leader appeared to be in his mid-50s, with a thick gray beard and dark sunglasses. Frank continued reading his newspaper, but his old military instincts made him notice every detail about the newcomers. He watched from the corner of his eye as they walked through the door. their heavy boots making loud sounds on the diner's floor. The bell above the door rang 5 times as each man entered, much louder than its gentle ring when Frank had arrived earlier. The bikers chose the booth right next to Frank's corner spot. They were loud, laughing and talking as they settled in. Their leader, who the others called Big Mike, sat where he could look directly at Frank's booth. The old veteran could feel their eyes on him, but he kept his focus on his newspaper, just as he had learned to stay calm during tense situations in the war. "Hey, Grandpa," one of the younger bikers called out, "isn't it past your bedtime?" His friends laughed at this comment, but Frank didn't respond. He calmly turned another page of his newspaper, taking a slow sip of his coffee. This seemed to annoy the bikers even more. Sarah came to take their order, trying to hide her nervousness. "What can I get for you, gentlemen?" she asked, her hand slightly shaking as she held her notepad. The bikers ordered their breakfasts, lots of eggs, bacon, and pancakes. They made jokes that made Sarah uncomfortable, but she kept a professional smile on her face. While waiting for their food, the bikers got louder. They played rough music from a small speaker one of them had brought, ignoring the unhappy looks from other customers. Some regular customers finished their meals quickly and left, not wanting to deal with the noise and tension in their usually peaceful diner. Frank noticed Bob the mailman watching the situation with concern. Bob had served in the military too, though many years after Frank, and they shared a silent understanding. Bob gave Frank a questioning look, asking without words if he needed help, but Frank slightly shook his head. He had handled worse situations in his 93 years. The bikers' food arrived, but they didn't calm down. Instead, they got more confident. One of them, a man with many tattoos on his arms, deliberately stretched and bumped Frank's table, making his coffee cup rattle. "Oops," he said with a fake apology. "Didn't see you there, old-timer." Frank still didn't react. He carefully steadied his coffee cup and continued reading. His calm response seemed to frustrate the bikers even more. They weren't used to being ignored. Big Mike leaned back in his seat, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe we found ourselves a new morning hangout, boys, though some people might need to find a new place for their beauty sleep." The other customers in the diner watched the scene with growing worry. They had known Frank for years, had heard bits and pieces about his war service, and respected him deeply. But nobody knew quite what to do. Even Joe, the diner's owner, stood uncertainly behind the counter, torn between wanting to protect his longtime customer and fearing a confrontation with the bikers. Sarah tried to ease the tension by bringing Frank a fresh cup of coffee. As she poured it, she whispered, "Are you okay, Mr. Thompson? I can call someone if you'd like." Frank gave her a gentle smile and patted her hand. "No need to worry, dear," he said quietly. "I've seen worse days." The morning sun was now fully up, shining through the diner's windows. Another day was beginning in the small town, but this day was different. The peaceful routine that Frank Thompson had enjoyed for 10 years was changing, and everyone in Joe's diner could feel that something had to give. The question was, what would happen next? For the next 3 days, the bikers came to Joe's diner at exactly 8:00 a.m., half an hour after Frank's usual arrival time. Each morning, their motorcycles would shake the windows, and their loud voices would break the peaceful atmosphere that Frank had enjoyed for so many years. The regular customers started coming in earlier or later, trying to avoid the troubled hours. On this particular morning, Frank sat in his usual corner booth, but something was different. His newspaper remained folded on the table, and his eyes looked tired. He hadn't slept well the night before, thinking about his late wife, Mary. She would have known what to do about these bikers. She always knew how to handle difficult situations with grace and wisdom. Sarah noticed the change in Frank's behavior. As she brought him his usual wheat toast, she saw his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a deep, quiet anger he was trying to control. "The toast is extra warm today, Mr. Thompson," she said kindly, trying to lift his spirits. Frank gave her a small smile, but his eyes stayed serious. The bell rang as the bikers entered, right on schedule. Today, they were wearing their full leather outfits with extra patches and chains. Big Mike led them to their usual spot, but instead of sitting down immediately, he stopped at Frank's table. The diner went completely quiet. Even the sounds from the kitchen seemed to pause. "Well, look who's still here," Big Mike said, placing his heavy hands on Frank's table. "Don't you think it's time to find a new breakfast spot, Grandpa? This place needs some fresh blood." The other bikers snickered, spreading out behind their leader like a wall of black leather. Frank looked up slowly, his blue eyes meeting Big Mike's dark sunglasses. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Frank carefully picked up his coffee cup and took a sip, completely ignoring the large man looming over him. This made Big Mike's face turn red with anger. One of the younger bikers, the one with many tattoos, moved closer. "Hey, old man, our boss is talking to you," he said loudly. "Show some respect." These words made something change in Frank's expression. The corner of his mouth twitched slightly, and those who knew him well could see a familiar look coming into his eyes. The same look he got when he sometimes talked about his war days. Joe, the diner's owner, started moving from behind the counter, worried about what might happen next. But before he could reach them, one of the bikers accidentally on purpose knocked into Frank's table. The hot coffee in Frank's cup spilled across his newspaper and onto his lap. The bikers laughed, but their laughter died quickly, and Frank didn't jump or yell. Instead, he carefully placed his empty cup on the table and pulled out a clean handkerchief from his pocket. With slow, deliberate movements, he wiped the coffee from his hands. "You know," Frank said quietly, speaking for the first time in all my years, "I've learned that respect isn't something you demand." His voice was low but clear, carrying across the silent diner. "It's something you earn." Big Mike leaned down closer, his voice threatening. "And what would you know about earning respect, old man? Sitting here every day, taking up space with your newspaper and your memories." Frank's hand stopped moving. He folded the coffee-stained handkerchief carefully and placed it on the table. The morning sun coming through the windows caught the small pin on his jacket, a pin that only a few people had noticed before, but now seemed to shine brightly. Sarah, standing nearby with a coffee pot in her hands, recognized it first. It was a combat pin from World War II, specifically from the Pacific Theater. She had seen it clearly only once before, when Frank had shown it to her grandson during a school history project. The tension in the diner grew thicker. Other customers watched nervously, wondering what would happen next. Bob the mailman had stopped at the door, his bag of letters forgotten in his hands. Even the cook peeked through the kitchen window, everyone sensing that something important was about to happen. Frank Thompson, the quiet 93-year-old veteran who had been coming to Joe's diner for the past decade, was about to break his silence. And when he did, nothing would be the same again. The silence in Joe's diner felt heavy as Frank Thompson slowly pushed himself up from his seat. His movements were careful but deliberate, like a ship's captain preparing to face a storm. Though his body showed his 93 years, his eyes held a strength that made even the youngest biker take a small step back. Frank stood at his full height, which was surprisingly tall. He didn't hunch or lean on his cane like he usually did. Instead, he stood straight, the way he had learned in the Navy so many years ago. The morning sun through the windows caught his silver hair, making it look almost like a soldier's helmet. "You want to know what I know about respect?" Frank's voice was clear and strong, filling the entire diner. "Let me tell you a story about respect." He reached into his wallet and pulled out an old, worn photograph. The edges were yellow with age, but the image was still clear. A group of young sailors, standing on a ship's deck. Big Mike's face showed surprise at Frank's sudden change. The old man they had been bullying for days was transformed. Even with his simple sweater and old-fashioned tie, Frank now had the commanding presence of a military officer. "This picture," Frank continued, holding it up, "was taken on February 19, 1945. Do you know what day that was?" He paused, looking at each biker in turn. "That was the first day of the Battle of Iwo Jima. I was there, young man. I was 20 years old, serving on the U.S. Nevada." The diner had become so quiet that people could hear the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Sarah stood frozen with her coffee pot, tears forming in her eyes. She had never heard Frank talk about his war experiences before. "I watched 18-year-old boys become men in minutes," Frank said, his voice growing stronger. "I saw courage that would make your motorcycle stunts look like child's play. I lost my best friends on those waters. Men who gave their lives so people like you could have the freedom to ride your bikes and act tough in diners." Big Mike's face had changed. The angry look was gone, replaced by something else. A mix of shame and recognition. He slowly removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that looked troubled. "For 3 years," Frank continued, "I fought in the Pacific. Not for glory, not to prove I was tough, but because it was the right thing to do. We fought for a future where people could live in peace, where they could have breakfast in a diner without being harassed. Frank picked up his coffee-stained handkerchief and carefully wiped his hands again. You talk about respect, he said, looking directly at Big Mike. But respect isn't about making others feel small. It's about standing up for what's right, protecting those who need protection, and remembering the sacrifices of those who came before you. One of the younger bikers shifted uncomfortably and whispered something to his friend. The tough image they had been trying to project was cracking under the weight of Frank's words. So yes, Frank said, his voice becoming gentler but no less powerful, I do know something about earning respect. I earned it watching my friends die so you could be free. I earned it serving my country when it needed me. And I earned it by coming here every morning for 10 years, being part of this community, and treating everyone, even those who don't treat me well, with the dignity they deserve. The diner remained silent for several long moments after Frank finished speaking. The only sound was the quiet dripping of coffee from the overturned cup on Frank's table. His words hung in the air, heavy with truth and history. Big Mike stood perfectly still, the tough biker facade completely gone. In its place was the face of a man who had just realized he had made a terrible mistake. The photograph in Frank's hand seemed to draw his eyes, and something about it made his expression change even more. The moment had come for a response, and everyone in Joe's diner knew that what happened next would change everything. The question was, how would these bikers, who had spent days trying to intimidate an old veteran, react to learning exactly who they had been bullying? Big Mike's hands trembled as he reached into his leather jacket. The other bikers watched, confused, as their tough leader pulled out an old, folded photograph of his own. The diner remained silent as he carefully smoothed it out on Frank's table, right next to the coffee stains. Sir, Big Mike's voice was different now, softer and filled with emotion. Is this ship in your photo the U.S. Nevada? His finger pointed to the battleship in the background of Frank's picture. When Frank nodded, Big Mike's face turned pale. My father, Big Mike said, his voice breaking slightly, served on the U.S. Nevada during Iwo Jima. His name was Michael Sullivan Sr. He pushed his own photograph forward. It showed a young sailor in his dress whites, smiling at the camera. Frank's eyes widened as he looked at the picture. His hands, which had been steady during his whole speech, now shook slightly as he picked up the photograph. Mike Sullivan, he said quietly. We called him Sully. Frank looked up at Big Mike, seeing him in a completely new light. Your father was my radioman. Sarah quietly brought over a clean cloth to wipe the table. As she cleaned up the spilled coffee, she and everyone else in the diner watched this unexpected moment unfold. The tough biker leader looked more like a little boy now, hanging on Frank's every word. Sully saved my life, Frank continued, sitting back down in his booth. He gestured for Big Mike to join him. During a heavy attack, he pulled me to safety when a shell exploded near our position. He was one of the bravest men I ever knew. The other bikers moved closer, their earlier hostility completely gone. They pulled up chairs, forming a circle around the booth. The youngest one, who had been the loudest in mocking Frank, now looked at the ground, his face red with shame. Dad never talked much about the war, Big Mike said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He passed away 15 years ago, but he always said his time on the Nevada made him the man he was. I never knew the details. He looked at Frank with desperate hope. Would you tell me about him? Frank carefully arranged both photographs side by side on the clean tablecloth. Your father was a hero, he began. He kept our communications running during the worst battles. Always had a joke ready, even in the darkest moments. He helped keep our spirits up. The regular customers of the diner watched in amazement as the scene continued to unfold. Bob the mailman finally came all the way inside, quietly taking a seat at the counter. The cook stopped pretending to work and stood in the kitchen doorway, listening. And you know what else? Frank smiled, remembering. Your father loved motorcycles. He always talked about buying one after the war. Said he wanted to feel the wind in his face after spending so much time in the radio room. He looked at Big Mike's leather jacket with new understanding. I guess that love of bikes got passed down. Big Mike touched the patches on his jacket, looking at them differently now. All these years, he said, I've been trying to be tough, to be respected. But I've been doing it all wrong, haven't I? He looked around at his fellow bikers, who nodded in agreement. One of the other bikers stood up and walked to the counter. He came back with his wallet open, pulling out some money. "Sir," he said to Frank, "we'd like to pay for your breakfast. And," he hesitated, "if you're willing, we'd like to hear more stories about the war. About Sully, about all of it." The morning sun now filled the diner completely, making the two old photographs glow with a warm light. The clock on the wall showed it was past Frank's usual leaving time, but nobody was moving. They all knew they were witnessing something special, a moment where the past and present came together, where misunderstanding turned to understanding, and where respect was truly earned, not demanded. Frank Thompson, the 93-year-old veteran, looked at these men who had been his tormentors just minutes ago and saw something that made him smile. He saw the sons of his generation learning what their fathers had fought for. That morning stretched into afternoon at Joe's diner. Frank sat in his usual booth, but now he was surrounded by 5 attentive bikers who hung on his every word. Sarah kept the coffee flowing as Frank shared story after story about their time in the Pacific, especially about Sully, Big Mike's father. "Your father had this special way of handling the radio," Frank told Big Mike, his eyes bright with memories. "Even when the messages were bad news, he would somehow make everyone feel better. He used to say, 'Boys, as long as we can talk to each other, we're never alone out here.'" Big Mike pulled out his phone and showed Frank some pictures of his father from after the war. There was Sully with his first motorcycle, a beat-up old Harley he had bought in 1946. Another showed him teaching a young Big Mike how to ride a small bike. Frank smiled at each photo, adding his own memories to the stories behind them. The youngest biker, whose name was Tommy, couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "I'm so sorry for how we acted. We were trying to be tough guys, or we were just being bullies. My grandfather was in Vietnam, and he would be so ashamed of how I treated you." Frank reached across the table and patted Tommy's hand. "The past is the past, son," he said kindly. "What matters is what we learn from our mistakes. Your grandfather would be proud to see you admitting yours." Joe, the diner's owner, had been so moved by everything that he declared all their meals were on the house today. He even joined them for a while, bringing out some old photos of his own father who had served in Korea. The diner had become a place where 3 generations of military families shared their stories. The other customers who had stayed to watch were deeply touched. Many of them took pictures with their phones, not of the dramatic confrontation from earlier, but of this beautiful moment of reconciliation. Several older veterans who were regular customers joined the group, adding their own stories to the mix. "You know what we should do?" Big Mike said suddenly, standing up. "Mr. Thompson, would you allow us to escort you home today? Not because you need protection, you've proved you're tougher than all of us put together, but as a sign of respect." Frank looked at the big man, seeing now how much he looked like his father Sully. "I would be honored," he said. "But first I have a request." He pulled out his small notebook, the one where he had been writing his memories. "Would you boys help me write down some of these stories? My handwriting isn't what it used to be." Tommy immediately pulled out his tablet. "Sir, I can type everything you say. I'll make it into a proper document with pictures and everything. My girlfriend's good with computers. She can help make it look really professional." The other bikers joined in, each offering their own ways to help preserve Frank's memories. One was good with video and offered to record Frank telling his stories. Another suggested creating a social media group where veterans in town could share their experiences. Sarah watched all this from behind the counter, wiping happy tears from her eyes. The diner's regular morning crowd had turned into something beautiful, a bridge between generations, connecting young and old through shared stories and newfound respect. As the afternoon sun began to fade, Frank finally prepared to leave. But this time, he didn't walk alone. 5 motorcycles were lined up outside, their engines quiet, waiting to escort him home. Big Mike helped Frank put on his jacket, handling the old veteran with the same care he would have shown his own father. Before they left, Frank turned to the group. "You know," he said with a smile, "Sully would love seeing this, his son and his bite brothers, taking care of his old shipmate." He looked at each of the bikers in turn. "Sometimes the best families are the ones we find by accident." The bell above the door rang as they walked out together, not as strangers or enemies anymore, but as something new, something that had been forged in conflict but transformed by understanding and respect. A month had passed since that remarkable day at Joe's diner, and everything had changed. The morning routine that Frank Thompson had followed for 10 years was different now, but in the best possible way. Every day at 7:15 a.m., the sound of a single motorcycle would echo down the street, Big Mike arriving early to have breakfast with Frank. The changes in the diner were clear to everyone. Frank's corner booth had grown larger as Joe had pushed two tables together to make room for the regular morning group. The walls now displayed several framed photographs. The old picture of Frank and Sully on the US and Nevada, Sully with his first motorcycle, and a new photo of Frank surrounded by his 5 biker friends. Tommy had kept his promise about recording Frank's stories. He sat with his tablet every morning, carefully typing as Frank shared memories of the war and of Big Mike's father. The young biker had discovered he had a talent for writing, and the document had grown into something like a book. Local veterans started coming to the diner specifically to add their own stories to what they now called the Breakfast Chronicles. "You should have seen Sully that day," Frank was saying this morning as Big Mike listened intently. "The radio was broken, waves were crashing over the deck, but your father just kept working. Kept us all connected to home." Frank's eyes twinkled as he remembered. "Just like you're doing now, Mike, keeping me connected to the present." The other bikers arrived at their usual time, but now they parked their motorcycles quietly, respecting the peace of the morning. They had become protective of Frank, but not in an aggressive way. They made sure his coffee was always fresh, that his newspaper was delivered first thing in the morning, and that he never had to eat breakfast alone. Sarah noticed how the bikers had changed too. They were still tough-looking in their leather jackets, but they had added something new. Each wore a small pin that matched the World War II combat pin on Frank's jacket. It was their way of honoring the generation that had sacrificed so much. "Mr. Thompson," Tommy said, looking up from his tablet, "the local high school called yesterday. They want you to come speak to their history class about World War II. Would you like us to escort you there?" The young biker had become something of a secretary for Frank, helping organize the growing number of speaking requests he received. Frank smiled at the offer. "That would be nice," he said, "but only if you boys share your stories too. The students should know that service and sacrifice didn't end with my generation. They should hear about your work with the Veterans Motorcycle Group too." The Veterans Motorcycle Group had been Big Mike's idea. After learning about his father's service, he had transformed his bike club into something new. They now organized rides to raise money for veterans' causes and provided motorcycle escorts for military funerals. Frank had become their honorary president, though he politely declined their offer to teach him to ride. Joe came over to refill their coffee cups, beaming with pride at what his diner had become. It wasn't just a place to eat anymore. It was a gathering spot where stories were shared, friendships were made, and history was preserved. The morning regulars now included both veterans and young people, all drawn by the special atmosphere around Frank's corner booth. "You know what, Mr. Thompson?" Big Mike said, carefully straightening the frame holding his father's picture. "Dad would have loved this. All of us together, sharing stories, keeping memories alive. This is exactly what he fought for." Frank nodded, looking around at the faces that had become so dear to him in the past month. The bikers who had once tried to intimidate him were now like sons to him, that had given him something he hadn't even known he was missing, a new family. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, catching the silver in Frank's hair and the leather of the bikers' jackets. Outside, their motorcycles stood together, chrome gleaming in the light. It was a sight that would have seemed strange just a month ago, but now it felt perfectly right. A symbol of how the past and present could come together in unexpected and beautiful ways. 1 year had passed since the day Frank Thompson stood up to the bikers in Joe's diner. It was a special morning, Frank's 94th birthday, and the diner was decorated with red, white, and blue streamers. A large banner hung across the wall reading, "Happy birthday to our hero, Frank." The morning started earlier than usual. Big Mike and his fellow bikers had arrived at dawn to help Sarah and Joe decorate. They had spread the word through their Veterans Motorcycle Group, and bikes started filling the parking lot on both sides of the street. Veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and more recent conflicts came to celebrate with Frank. Tommy stood proudly next to a table displaying the finished product of their year's work, a published book titled Breakfast with Heroes, the stories of Frank Thompson and the US and Nevada. The book contained not only Frank's memories but also stories from other local veterans, all carefully collected during their morning conversations at the diner. "Can you believe it, Mr. Thompson?" Tommy said, holding up the book. We've already sold 500 copies, and all the money is going to the Veterans Support Fund. The young biker had discovered his true calling through this project. He was now taking classes to become a military historian. Frank sat in his usual corner booth, which had been decorated with a special tablecloth and a small model of the U.S. Nevada. His coffee cup had been replaced for the day with a new one that read World's Best Veteran, a gift from Sarah. His hands touched the model ship gently, remembering the real vessel and the brave men who had served on her. Big Mike stood up, tapping his coffee cup with a spoon to get everyone's attention. The diner fell quiet as he began to speak. "A year ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I walked into this diner as a different man. My father had served in World War II, but I had forgotten the values he fought for. Then I met Frank Thompson." The big biker paused, looking at Frank with deep respect. Frank didn't just tell us stories about the war. He taught us what real strength looks like. It's not about being tough or scary. It's about standing up for what's right, treating others with dignity, and remembering those who came before us. As if on cue, the door opened, and a special guest entered, a young naval officer in full-dress uniform. He walked to Frank's table and saluted. "Mr. Thompson," the officer said formally, "on behalf of the United States Navy, I'm here to present you with something that's been long overdue." The officer opened a small box, revealing a medal. "Your actions during the Battle of Iwo Jima have been reviewed, and the Navy has decided to award you the Silver Star for gallantry in action." The diner erupted in applause as the medal was pinned to Frank's jacket, right next to his combat pin. Frank stood slowly, supported by Big Mike on one side and Tommy on the other. His eyes were wet with tears, but his voice was strong as he addressed the crowd. "This medal," he said, touching it gently, "belongs to all of us, to the men I served with like Sully, to their children like Mike, who carry on their legacy, and to the young people like Tommy, who make sure our stories aren't forgotten." Sarah brought out a large birthday cake decorated with an image of the U.S. Nevada. As everyone sang "Happy Birthday," Frank looked around at the faces surrounding him, bikers, veterans, regular customers, all now part of his extended family. What had started as a confrontation had grown into something beautiful, a bridge between generations, a keeper of memories, a reminder of what real courage and respect meant. The morning sun shone through the diner's windows, glinting off the chrome of dozens of motorcycles outside. Inside, the past and present had come together in perfect harmony. Frank Thompson, the 94-year-old veteran who had changed so many lives with his quiet strength, smiled at his unlikely family. "You know what Sully used to say?" Frank asked, looking at Big Mike. "He said that the bravest thing a person can do is admit when they're wrong and try to make it right." Looking around this room today, I'd say he was absolutely right about that.